The night is heavy with silence, broken only by the ticking of a clock in a darkened room at Blenheim Palace, the grand seat of the Marlborough family. The date is November 30th, 1874. A child has just been born into a dynasty tied to England's military past, a boy who would grow to embody both the grandeur and the contradictions of the empire. He is named Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, a descendant of the great Duke of Marlborough, born not in the nursery but in a hastily prepared cloakroom 2 months premature. From the beginning, his life is marked by drama and the weight of destiny. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, a brilliant but volatile politician, dreams of rising to the highest offices of state. His mother, Jenny Jerome, is an American socialite of dazzling beauty, a woman of ambition, charm, and scandalous rumors. For Winston, childhood is a lonely apprenticeship to greatness. Sent to boarding schools, dismissed as unruly and slow to learn, he struggles with academics but shines in history and English composition. His handwriting is clumsy, his spelling erratic, yet his words already carry a spark of power. At Harrow, the great public school, he is mocked as stubborn and reckless, but his teachers notice an extraordinary memory and a fascination with war. He devours tales of soldiers, campaigns, and empires, imagining himself not as a student but as a warrior destined to command. The boy who cannot master Latin or mathematics finds salvation in words and battles, shaping an identity that will one day become inseparable from Britain's fate. By the 1890s, the British Empire stands astride the world, but its confidence is strained. Social inequality is sharpening. Ireland is restless, and in Africa and Asia, colonial expansion breeds both glory and resentment. Into this crucible steps the young Churchill, determined not to fade into obscurity, like so many of his generation. Rejected twice for Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy, he finally secures a place on the third attempt. The humiliation steels his resolve. He will fight harder than any of his peers to prove himself. As a cavalry officer, he finds himself dispatched to Cuba at just 21, a war correspondent observing Spanish forces battling rebels. It is here that his addiction to adventure takes root. He drinks in the smoke of gunfire, the chaos of combat, and learns a lesson that will shape his life. Words can be as powerful as weapons. Writing for British newspapers, he transforms his battlefield observations into dramatic dispatches, earning both income and fame. India follows. He is posted to Bangalore, where the young officer fills long, hot days not with leisure but with study. He reads voraciously Macaulay, Gibbon, Plato, Aristotle, teaching himself politics, philosophy, and history. He is fashioning a mind that blends the soldier's pragmatism with the statesman's breadth. Yet beneath the discipline, there is still the thrill-seeker. When a chance comes to ride into combat on the northwest frontier against Pashtun tribesmen, he seizes it, charging into battle with reckless courage, bullets snapping the air around him. But it is in the Sudan in 1898, at the Battle of Omdurman, that Churchill experiences the raw brutality of modern war. With the 21st Lancers, he participates in one of the last great cavalry charges in history, sabers flashing against the mightiest warriors. Nearly cut down in the melee, he survives, later describing the carnage with unflinching detail. His writings grip the British public, elevating his name far beyond the barracks. Already, he is more than a soldier. He is a storyteller of empire, his prose shaping public imagination as much as his deeds. Fame grows, but ambition burns brighter. He resigns his commission to pursue politics, yet the lure of danger draws him once more into battle, this time to South Africa during the Boer War. As a war correspondent once again, he joins an armored train ambushed by Boer fighters. Captured, he is imprisoned in Pretoria. The humiliation could have ended his career before it began. Instead, he engineers a daring escape, scaling walls, hiding in shadows, traveling hundreds of miles to freedom. The newspapers back home trumpet the tale of his courage, and Britain hails him as a hero. At 25, Churchill is already a national celebrity. The stage is set for his entry into Parliament. In 1900, he wins election as a Conservative member for Oldham, bringing with him not only battlefield exploits, but also the pen of a master orator. His speeches crackle with defiance, wit, and conviction. Yet Churchill is restless, never a man to serve the party line. Within 4 years, he shocks his colleagues by crossing the floor to the Liberal Party, arguing that his principles cannot be bound by blind loyalty. The act brands him as opportunistic in the eyes of many. But for Churchill, politics is a battlefield no less than Omdurman or Pretoria. Survival and victory demand bold moves. As a liberal, he champions reforms for workers, trade unions, and Social Security, aligning himself with progressives even as his aristocratic heirs make him an unlikely ally of the poor. He is appointed president of the Board of Trade, then Home Secretary, where he confronts strikes, riots, and unrest with both reform and force. Critics accuse him of authoritarian impulses, pointing to his decision to deploy troops against strikers. Admirers see in him a leader unafraid to act. But it is at the Admiralty that his vision finds its grandest stage. Appointed First Lord in 1911, he surveys a Europe sliding toward catastrophe. The German Empire is arming at a terrifying pace, its navy challenging Britain's supremacy on the seas. Churchill modernizes the Royal Navy, shifting ships from coal to oil, championing new technologies, and preparing for war he senses is inevitable. When the storm of 1914 breaks, Britain is ready in no small part because of his foresight. Yet war is merciless to reputations. In 1915, Churchill stakes his future on a daring plan. The Dardanelles campaign, aimed at knocking the Ottoman Empire out of the war and opening a supply route to Russia. The Gallipoli landings turn to disaster, with tens of thousands of Allied soldiers killed or maimed. The blame falls squarely on Churchill's shoulders. Hounded by critics, abandoned by allies, he is forced to resign. For a man who has known only ascent, it is a shattering fall. Stripped of power, his name blackened, Churchill does the unthinkable. He rejoins the army and takes command of a battalion on the Western Front. In the mud and slaughter of the trenches, he fights not only the Germans but despair itself. Night after night, shells thunder overhead. Men are cut down in no man's land, and the future seems closed. Yet in the chaos, Churchill sketches, writes, and plans, refusing to let defeat define him. He knows his time will come again. When the war ends, he claws his way back into politics, first as Minister of Munitions, then Secretary of State for War and Air. He becomes a central voice in the turbulent peace, helping to shape the map of the Middle East, sending troops against Bolsheviks in Russia, and warning of dangers ahead. But his harsh stance against striking miners in 1926 and his deep opposition to Indian self-rule alienate many. By the 1930s, he is out of step with the political mood of a nation. Then, darker clouds begin to gather. A new force is rising on the continent, led by a man whose voice rages across Germany, promising revenge and conquest. Adolf Hitler. Britain, weary of war, seeks appeasement. Churchill, isolated and mocked, issues dire warnings. He insists Germany is rearming at a pace that threatens Europe's survival. He is dismissed as a relic, a warmonger clinging to past glories. But in his heart, Churchill knows he is right. And as 1939 approaches, the world begins to learn just how right he was. September 1st, 1939. German tanks roll into Poland, their iron tracks crushing borders, treaties, and illusions. The Blitzkrieg has begun, a storm of fire and steel unlike anything Europe has seen. 2 days later, Britain declares war. Suddenly, the warnings of Winston Churchill, long ridiculed, ring with chilling accuracy. The man cast into the wilderness is called back to power. Neville Chamberlain, desperate for unity, appoints him First Lord of the Admiralty once again. A signal is flashed to every ship in the fleet. Winston is back. Sailors cheer, knowing the restless spirit who had once rebuilt the Navy now guides them in their darkest hour. But Churchill's return is not triumph. It is trial. In the first months of war, Britain suffers a string of humiliating defeats. Norway, a campaign Churchill himself champions, ends in disaster. Chamberlain's government crumbles. On May 10, 1940, as German armies surge into Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, the king summons Churchill to Buckingham Palace. The decision is clear. He is to become Prime Minister of Britain at the very moment the nation faces annihilation. It is a burden few could bear. France is collapsing. Hitler's forces seem unstoppable, and Britain stands nearly alone. Yet Churchill, with cigar clenched and eyes blazing, embraces the role for which his entire life has prepared him. He forms a coalition government and vows to fight on, no matter the cost. On May 13th, he addresses the House of Commons in words that pierce through centuries. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. The nation rallies, but fear spreads like a shadow. In June, the miracle of Dunkirk unfolds. Hundreds of thousands of British and Allied soldiers, trapped on the beaches by German forces, await destruction. Through a desperate naval operation, aided by civilian boats of every shape and size, over 330,000 men are rescued. Churchill calls it deliverance, but he refuses to paint it as victory. He warns his people the struggle will be long, grim, and merciless. A few weeks later, France falls. The Union Jack now flutters over a solitary fortress, the last free bastion in Western Europe. Hitler turns his gaze across the Channel. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, looms. The Luftwaffe launches a campaign to destroy the Royal Air Force and pave the way for invasion. What follows is the Battle of Britain, a duel in the skies that will decide the fate of freedom. From underground war rooms, Churchill monitors every report, visiting bombed cities, standing amidst rubble with defiance etched into his face. He tells Parliament, "We shall defend our island. Whatever the cost may be, we shall never surrender." His words become the armor of a nation. Night after night, the Blitz rains fire upon London and other cities. Homes are shattered, families buried beneath debris, but still the people endure. Churchill moves among them. Fearless even in the aftermath of raids, his presence a living symbol of resilience. Children cheer him, workers salute him, and ordinary citizens draw strength from his indomitable spirit. Yet behind closed doors, he wrestles with despair, chain-smoking, pacing, scribbling notes at all hours, haunted by the weight of every decision. While Britain holds its ground, the world shifts. In June 1941, Hitler turns east, unleashing Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. Churchill, who despises communism, faces a brutal choice. Yet he knows the greater enemy. Without hesitation, he declares support for Stalin, announcing, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." The alliance of necessity is forged, binding Britain to the Soviet struggle. Across the Atlantic, Churchill pins his hopes on America. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sympathizes, but faces a reluctant Congress and people wary of another European war. Still, through letters, meetings, and secret envoys, Churchill cultivates a partnership. In August 1941, the two leaders meet aboard warships off Newfoundland, drafting the Atlantic Charter, a vision of a post-war world built on freedom and self-determination. The seeds of the special relationship are sown. Yet Churchill knows America's entry into the war remains uncertain. That uncertainty ends on December 7th, 1941. Japan strikes Pearl Harbor. The United States is thrust into conflict, and Churchill, upon hearing the news, declares with relief, "So we had won after all," for he knows that with America and the Soviet Union as allies, the tide can be turned. But the cost will be unimaginable. The next years are a crucible of fire. North Africa becomes a testing ground, where Churchill gambles on generals to strike back at the Axis. After setbacks, victory at El Alamein in 1942 marks a turning point. "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat," he proclaims. The Allies push into Italy, battling through mountains and rivers against fierce German resistance. Each step forward is bought with blood. In Tehran in 1943, Churchill meets Roosevelt and Stalin face to face. Three men, bound by common cause but divided by ideology, argue, joke, and plan the course of the war. Churchill pushes for a Mediterranean strategy, wary of a premature assault on France. Stalin demands a second front. Roosevelt mediates. The weight of personalities in politics collides with the fate of millions. Churchill knows Britain, exhausted and bomb-scarred, is no longer the giant of empire it once was. The future belongs to the Americans and Russians, and he must navigate this shifting balance with every ounce of his cunning. At home, the strain is crushing. Food is rationed. Cities lie in ruins, and families grieve. Churchill bears not only the mantle of war leader, but also the scrutiny of a democratic people. Some criticize his imperial stubbornness, especially in India, where famine in Bengal in 1943 claims millions of lives. His refusal to grant independence during the war fuels bitter resentment. Admirers see him as a lion standing against tyranny. Detractors accuse him of clinging to a dying empire at terrible human cost. Still, his voice thunders across the airwaves. His speech is a lifeline in the darkest nights. The man once scorned as a reckless opportunist has become the embodiment of Britain's will to survive. Yet as 1944 dawns, the greatest gamble of all approaches, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, is being prepared in utmost secrecy. The Allies will storm Hitler's fortress Europe, but if they fail, the war could be lost. Churchill knows the risks, the staggering losses that could follow. He insists on being present on D-Day itself, ready to share the danger with his men. The king forbids it, fearing the loss of his prime minister in battle. Reluctantly, Churchill concedes. And so, on June 6, 1944, as thousands of ships cross the channel and paratroopers drop into darkness, Churchill waits, pacing, chain-smoking, his heart bound to the fate of every soldier on those beaches. By nightfall, the Allies have gained their foothold. The liberation of Europe has begun, but with victory inching closer. Churchill senses that the challenges awaiting him may be even greater than the war itself. The beaches of Normandy are secured, and Allied armies surge across France. Paris is liberated in August 1944. Crowds filling the streets in joyous defiance of their former occupiers. Churchill visits the city soon after, standing beside Charles de Gaulle, the embodiment of free France. The moment is triumphant, but Churchill's mind is already racing beyond the celebration. He knows the war is far from over, and that peace, when it comes, will bring battles of a different kind. As 1945 dawns, the Allies advance inexorably toward Germany. The Yalta Conference brings Churchill once again to the table with Roosevelt and Stalin. The Big Three map out the shape of the post-war world. Stalin presses his demands for influence over Eastern Europe. Roosevelt seeks the birth of a United Nations. Churchill, weary but determined, struggles to preserve Britain's influence amidst these giants. He fears that Europe will be divided between American power and Soviet domination, leaving Britain diminished. Yet with the Red Army occupying vast territories, his bargaining power is weak. Back in London, the bombs have ceased, but the scars of war remain everywhere. Shattered homes, rationed queues, grieving families. Still, Churchill's voice continues to inspire, reminding his people of how far they have come. And then, in May 1945, the day arrives that his long-awaited Germany surrenders. Crowds flood Whitehall, singing, cheering, embracing strangers in wild relief. From the balcony of the Ministry of Health, Churchill waves his hat, the architect of survival, the lion who refused to yield. For a moment, he is not just a man, but a living symbol of victory. Yet even in that hour of triumph, shadows gather. Britain is exhausted, nearly bankrupt, its empire strained to breaking. In the summer of 1945, with the war against Japan still raging, Churchill calls a general election. He expects gratitude, believing the people will return him to power. Instead, the result is stunning. The Labour Party, under Clement Attlee, wins in a landslide. The people who adored Churchill, the war leader, reject Churchill, the politician. His promises of empire and tradition cannot compete with Labour's vision of welfare, housing, and a new social order. The man who saved Britain is cast aside, his role seemingly finished. The blow is crushing. On the very day of Japan's surrender, Churchill is a private citizen once again, watching the birth of a new world from the sidelines. Yet retirement cannot silence his restless spirit. He retreats to Chartwell, his beloved country home, where he writes, paints, and reflects. But he does not fade. Instead, he sharpens his pen, crafting the memoirs that will later secure his place as one of history's greatest writers. His voice, though absent from office, still carries weight. In 1946, invited to speak in Fulton, Missouri, Churchill delivers a warning that shocks the world. An iron curtain has descended across Europe, dividing East from West. His words crystallize the reality of Soviet domination, shaping the very language of the Cold War. Many criticize him for stirring tension, but once again, he sees danger where others cling to illusion. The late 1940s bring new challenges for Britain. India, long the jewel of the empire, gains independence in 1947. For Churchill, it is a bitter loss, one he opposed with ferocity, believing empire essential to Britain's greatness. Yet the tide of history is unstoppable. Across Asia and Africa, colonial power unravels. Churchill rails against it, but his voice is increasingly out of step with the world. Still, politics is never far from his reach. In 1951, at 76 years old, he returns as Prime Minister. The world is transformed. America and the Soviet Union are superpowers. Nuclear weapons have changed warfare forever, and Britain is no longer the mighty empire it once was. Yet Churchill steps once more into the breach, determined to guide his nation through the perilous currents of the Cold War. His second premiership is marked by contradictions. At home, he oversees modest reforms and grapples with economic decline. Abroad, he pursues a vision of peace through strength, urging negotiation with Moscow while maintaining Britain's defenses. His speeches now carry the gravitas of an elder statesman, less fiery than before but steeped in wisdom. He supports European unity, foreseeing the need for cooperation to prevent another war. But age and illness weigh heavily. He suffers strokes, his memory falters, and the fire that once blazed begins to dim. By 1955, acknowledging his frailty, Churchill resigns. Anthony Eden succeeds him, and the old warrior retreats once more to Chartwell. There he spends his final years writing, painting, and receiving visitors who come to pay homage. His memoirs of the Second World War win him the Nobel Prize in Literature, an honor that recognizes not only his command of history, but his mastery of language itself. Yet even as accolades pour in, Churchill is haunted by questions. Had he preserved Britain's greatness, or merely delayed its decline? Had his love of empire blinded him to the future? Admirers see him as a savior of freedom. Critics remember his stubbornness, his blunders, his harshness. He is both lion and man, brilliant and flawed, celebrated and controversial. As the 1960s approach, the once tireless figure is frail, his voice quieted, his gaze often distant. The world he shaped moves on. Kennedy, Khrushchev, and decolonization dominate headlines. Churchill lives in the shadows of his own legend, revered but no longer commanding. Yet even in decline, his presence evokes awe. For those who look upon him, he is the embodiment of an age when Britain stood alone and refused to bow. Then, in January 1965, after years of fading strength, Winston Churchill suffers a final stroke. The news sweeps the globe. For days he lingers, his family by his side, as the world waits. On January 24th, he dies at the age of 90, exactly 70 years after the death of his father. The man who once said he was walking with destiny has reached the end of his journey. But destiny had one last honor to bestow. Queen Elizabeth II orders a state funeral, the first for a commoner since the Duke of Wellington. Leaders from across the globe gather in London. Presidents, prime ministers, kings, and queens. Millions watch as his coffin is borne through silent streets, draped in a Union Jack. Sailors pulling the gun carriage with ropes, Big Ben tolling in mournful rhythm. As the barge carrying him down the Thames passes, cranes bow in unison, a final salute to the man who had once saved their nation. And yet, even as the world bids farewell, the story of Winston Churchill is not over. For his legacy, vast and contested, will echo across generations. Was he the savior of democracy, the last great imperialist, or a complex mixture of both? That question will be debated as long as history is told. But one truth is certain. In humanity's darkest hour, when tyranny threatened to engulf civilization, it was his voice, his courage, his indomitable will that kept the flame of freedom alive. Still, the flame he carried into the world was not without shadow. And as the years pass, the controversies and contradictions of Churchill's life would ignite new battles over memory, empire, and truth. The decades after his death turned Winston Churchill into both legend and lightning rod. Statues rose across Britain and beyond, his likeness cast in bronze, his name inscribed in stone. School children learned of the lion who roared against Hitler, and historians hailed him as the man who saved civilization. But history is never still, and the same man who inspired a nation also provoked fierce debate. For many, he remained the indomitable symbol of resistance, the leader whose words, spoken in Britain's darkest days, had forged steel in the hearts of millions. Yet others pointed to the harder truths. His unyielding defense of empire, his resistance to Indian independence, his decisions during the Bengal famine of 1943, and his views on race revealed a leader bound a world he inherited, not the one emerging. Admirers saw pragmatism and loyalty to Britain's survival. Critics saw prejudice and imperial arrogance. This duality is what makes Churchill so enduring. He was not a flawless savior, but a man of towering strengths and profound flaws. He possessed extraordinary foresight in some moments and disastrous misjudgment in others. The Dardanelles debacle of 1915, his economic policies in the 1920s, and his stubborn clinging to empire are as much a part of his story as the soaring speeches of 1940 or the resolve that carried Britain through the Blitz. His life was a study in paradox. Aristocrat and democrat, warmonger and peacemaker, visionary and reactionary, a man who could see further than most yet be blinded by his own convictions. Even in his own lifetime, he understood this complexity. "History will be kind to me," he once said, "for I intend to write it." And write it he did. His 6-volume account of the Second World War shaped how generations would remember those years, painting him as both actor and narrator. His pen, as powerful as his voice, gave him control of the story. Yet even that control could not silence dissenting voices. For every admirer who crowned him a hero, there was another who asked whether Britain's survival came at cost history has yet to fully reckon with. Yet beyond the debates, the core of his legacy remains unshaken. In 1940, when much of Europe lay under Nazi boots and the United States stood aside, Churchill embodied defiance. He made the impossible seem possible, gave courage when logic whispered despair, and held the line long enough for the world to rally. Without him, the outcome of the Second World War and the fate of freedom itself might have been very different. But legacy is more than a single moment. The Cold War world he helped shape carried both triumph and tragedy. His Iron Curtain warning foresaw decades of division, nuclear peril, and ideological struggle. His vision of European unity, dismissed in his time, later became the foundation of integration. His dream of a lasting Anglo-American partnership endures as one of the defining relationships of the modern era. Even his flaws, his clinging to empire and his blindness to the winds of change, serve as reminders of the limits of even the greatest leaders. In the end, Winston Churchill remains larger than life because he embodied the very contradictions of the 20th century. The age of empires and the dawn of democracy, the savagery of war and the yearning for peace, the persistence of prejudice and the fight for liberty, all of these currents ran through him. He was a man of his era, yet at critical moments he transcended it. January 30th, 1965, as his body was laid to rest in a quiet churchyard Bladen, near his birthplace of Blenheim Palace, the nation that had followed him through war and peace stood still. The world saluted him not as a saint nor as a villain, but as a man who had carried civilization through fire. Trains stopped. Silence fell. The bells tolled not just for a leader, but for an age. And as the coffin sank into the earth, the story of Winston Churchill did not end. It began again in the telling. In every generation that would weigh his failures against his triumphs, his shadows against his light. He had once declared that he walked with destiny, that all his past life was but preparation for his hour of trial. That hour came, and he met it. The image remains indelible. A solitary figure, bulldog spirit, words like thunder, standing firm when the world seemed doomed. His flaws cannot erase that moment, nor can his triumphs erase his flaws. To study Churchill is to confront history itself, glorious and grim, noble and flawed, luminous and dark. And perhaps that is why his story endures. Because in the end, Winston Churchill was not a myth nor a monument, but a man. And it was as a man, flawed, stubborn, brilliant, relentless, that he shaped the fate of nations and left behind a legacy that still burns with power, controversy, and awe.